Welcome back, everybody. It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. And this time I'm going to be going over my 5 favorite and 5 least favorite wide receiver values in this draft this season. That is in fantasy football for this season. I'm going to highlight both auction values and standard draft values. So I'll sort of highlight both where I rank them just in terms of ADP, along with where they're actually being drafted. And then I'll also give you guys how much I think I'd be willing to spend on them compared to how much you should expect to be spending on them in an auction draft, just based off of how much they're supposed to go for given their current ADP. So really fun making these videos. It's always fun sort of seeing a little bit of the surprises here. Most of these players, it's not exactly the order that they come up in, but it's effectively just me. I've generated a regression model that sort of goes over how much you should expect to pay for each position based off of what positional ranking they are, and then went over exactly how much I'd be willing to pay for them in that case. And then it's just sort of got sorted by what the largest discrepancy is between those two numbers. There's a couple exceptions there just because there were some guys that I didn't necessarily agree with calling values or not values, and there were also just a couple of guys I didn't talk about because I've talked about a lot this offseason. But in general, these are 5 guys that I am in each category that I think I'm really either trying to target or avoid. And it's a lot of fun looking at all these guys. If you guys do want to take a look at my full rankings, projections, expected auction value, and all that, they're on my website. Just go to the website, www.realsteelffb.com. There's a little Excel icon on the homepage. You can click that. It'll download all that stuff for you, and I'll try and keep that updated on like a semi-weekly basis and all that. So it's going to be a lot of fun. And yeah, with that, let's just get into the first player here. Starting off with my favorite value at the wide receiver position is actually going to be DJ Moore, and I was actually really surprised to find myself this much higher than consensus on DJ Moore. He's not historically been a player that I've been super high on, just from a fantasy standpoint, because he's never really had a quarterback that would have supported high-end production, and I think we've all seen that he's a really high-end performer. He's clearly an elite wide receiver in the NFL, and he just really hasn't been able to get consistent quarterback play that's resulted in high-end fantasy finishes, but he slots in right now as my wide receiver 13 with an ADP of wide receiver 22, so that's a really huge discrepancy, just especially this early on in drafts. He's currently being drafted like at the end of the 3rd round, and I'm basically giving him like a mid to late 2nd round grade here, so I am really high on DJ Moore here, and I don't think people realize just how good he was last season. He finished last season as the wide receiver 6 overall, and he had horrific quarterback play. He had to deal with backup quarterbacks and Justin Fields, who's now a backup quarterback. And even if you take out his huge explosion game against the Washington Commanders last season, he was still the wide receiver 13 in fantasy points per game. So we can take out this guy's best game from the season. It was a monster game, a 200-yard, 3 performance, and he still put up low-end wide receiver 1 numbers basically over the course of the season with bad quarterback play. And I think he's still the clear wide receiver 1 in this offense. I know people are worried about maybe Keenan Allen comes in and reduces his target share just a little bit, but I would expect this offense to be a lot more pass heavy this season, and they should be more efficient as a passing team as well. So I think that really he's the clear wide receiver 1 and the best offense he's ever been a part of, and he's currently being drafted 9 spots behind where he would have finished last season if you took out his best game. So I think you should be expecting to spend roughly 10% of your budget on DJ Moore just based off of where he's being drafted, and I'm honestly willing to spend up to 20% here. I think he could be a guy, if you want to go running back early on in a draft and then make him your wide receiver 1. I think you could do a lot worse than that, but the real beauty here is that you can draft him as a low-end wide receiver 2, and I think he's going to give you high-end wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 1 numbers this season. So super excited about Moore. I want to get a lot of him this year, and it's honestly the first year that I've been willing to say that. Next up, we've got my second favorite value at the wide receiver position, and again, it's tough to call this guy a value because he's currently being drafted early in the 2nd round, but it's going to be Marvin Harrison Jr., who I just absolutely love this season. I currently have him ranked as my wide receiver 6, despite an ADP of wide receiver 9, and maybe I'm drinking the Kool-Aid too much here. I know he's obviously he's being penciled in as a Hall of Famer already, and obviously that is presumptuous. He is a rookie, and we never really know exactly how these guys are going to come into the NFL, but I think he's just the best prospect we've seen come into the NFL in a long time. I think maybe he starts slow because he's a rookie wide receiver, but he should be the number 1 target in what should be a really good offense. I'm fully expecting Kyler Murray to perform at a high level this season, and I think Harrison could legitimately be a top 5 wide receiver for us over the back half of the season. And in general, when I'm drafting guys in fantasy, I'm targeting guys that I expect to peak and perform at a higher level over the back half of the season. Especially as a tiebreaker there, I want a guy that can win me my league, not a guy that's going to tail off over the back half of the year. And we really just don't even know what the ceiling is for Marvin Harrison. He's clearly a guy that can put up monster numbers. He's got a build where he could easily put up double-digit touchdowns. I'm super excited to see what he could do this season. I think he's got a good shot to potentially beat the rookie receiving yardage record that Puka broke last year. And at his current ADP, you are expected to pay a pretty penny. You'd be looking at paying roughly 27.5% of your budget, and I'm willing to spend a little bit more than 30%, and that does end up getting me a lot of him, and I'll highlight this later on as well. And the reason he actually made this video is If you go look on like a platform like ESPN, Harrison's only slotted to cost you like 15% of your budget. That is an insane value. It's obviously going to be different by different platforms and all that, so there will be videos in the future highlighting what values there are on different platforms and sort of giving you guys what the edge is going to be there. But that's part of why Harrison made this video, is because there's a platform where he's just like screaming value right now. I'm super excited about Harrison. I want to get him on a lot of my teams, and he's a guy that I really do think could be somehow still undervalued despite being drafted as a top 10 receiver as a rookie. Next up, we've got one of my personal favorites this season, and that's going to be Diontae Johnson, who's probably going to end up on a very high and potentially unhealthy amount of my rosters this season, especially in PPR formats. And I currently have him ranked as my wide receiver 25 with an ADP of wide receiver 40. I want to highlight as well that I really did have to nerf him in my rankings just based off of my draft board. Just purely off of projections, he statted out as my wide receiver 16 in PPR, so I was a little high there. I don't think he's got the same ceiling as some of the other guys, so I had to knock him down a little bit, but I really do think he's going to be a high-end performer for us this season, and I just fully expect him to be a better version of what Adam Thielen was last year. And for those of you who don't remember, Adam Thielen was a legitimate wide receiver 1 for the first half of last season. I also fully expect this offense to at least be a little bit better than it was last season. It's really got nowhere to go but up. Bryce Young should take at least somewhat of a step forward in year 2. I'm a big believer in Dave Canales. He's going to get the most out of this offense. And Diontae is just actually an elite wide receiver. I don't think he gets the credit he deserves because he's had such bad quarterback play over the course of his career. But got to remember, in Big Ben's final season, he finished as the wide receiver 7, and he did that while Big Ben was not good at football anymore. So Diontae's been a high-end performer with bad quarterback play before, and even if he doesn't necessarily hit that ceiling, he's going to have so much volume that I think he's just going to be a free wide receiver 2 for us, a really consistent guy on our rosters. And he's got ceiling beyond that. Like I said, he's been a wide receiver 1 before, and he's also just dirt cheap. At his current ADP, you'd be looking at spending roughly 2.5% of your budget on him. He's effectively going in like the 9th round right now. Not a guy that people are excited about, and I'd personally be willing to spend up to 11% on him. That's obviously on the high end of things, especially when you're in an auction draft. You're probably going to get to the point in the draft where hopefully you don't have 11% left to spend on this guy, so you shouldn't need to do that. But just based off of where I have him ranked, I'd be comfortable doing that. I'd be super comfortable with him as my wide receiver 2, and if he's your wide receiver 3 or 4, you're really just locked and loaded for the whole season here. Next up, we've got Jalen Waddle, one of my next favorite values at the wide receiver position, and I think really the issue here is just that Waddle is clearly an elite player that's just simply being underpriced because of a little bit of bad luck last season. We didn't see quite as many explosive plays out of him as we saw last season. He was sort of banged up on and off. He only played in the 60th percentile of snaps last season compared to being in like the mid-70s the year before. That's going to go up even if we didn't necessarily miss a lot of games this year. If you had Waddle on your team or even watched enough football, you probably saw a lot of announcements that Waddle was leaving games with injury and then coming back in, and he just really couldn't get right and be 100% at any point last season. But he's shown that he can be a top 10 wide receiver in this offense, and he's also got built-in top 3 upside, honestly. If something were to happen to Tyreek Hill, I personally think Jalen Waddle's plenty talented enough to be a top 3 fantasy asset if Tyreek Hill were to get hurt. So just having that built-in upside is also something that we can be super excited about. And he's being drafted as the wide receiver 15 right now, and he slots in as my wide receiver 12. And being 3 spots ahead of ADP for me it's a pretty big deal when you're this high up in the draft boards. And to me, he's just honestly one of the best wide receiver 2s you can get on your roster, and I think he could easily be a league-winning asset. He's still got it in him to be a top 7, top 8 wide receiver with a healthy Tyreek Hill, and I'd be happy to spend just over 22% of my budget on him. You should be expected to spend roughly 16% on that on this player right now, so quite a bit of value there. I definitely am ending up with a lot of Jalen Waddle, and again, I'll highlight ESPN as well. He'll probably make the ESPN video. On ESPN, he costs you like 11% of your budget, so he's a screaming value there. I definitely want to get a ton of him on ESPN while we still can. And the last value in my top 5 wide receiver values this video is going to be George Pickens. And I think the issue here is Pickens is just an elite wide receiver that's clearly being drafted at his floor, and he's got an insane ceiling. We don't really know how great George Pickens can be, but we got to remember that he finished with 1,140 receiving yards last season and 5 touchdowns in an offense that was anemic. There was no good quarterback play. We saw a lot of Mason Rudolph at the end of the season, and that was the best quarterback play George Pickens has had over the course of his career. Year 3 is a very common year for young wide receivers to really have like the best season of their career. We normally see a step up in year 2, and then year 3 is where these guys really make their peak. And I think George Pickens really has it in him here. He's getting the benefit of decreased target competition. The aforementioned Diontae Johnson is no longer a Pittsburgh Steeler, and on top of that, you're bringing in Russell Wilson here, who maybe Russell's not what he used to be, but he's still a huge upgrade over the quarterback play he had the last couple of years. And think he's got legitimate top 10 upside. We've seen how explosive he can be. He's a really great deep threat, and we know that if Russ can still do one thing great, it is throw a really great deep ball. This is going to be a really efficient offense. I think George Pickens has a shot at double-digit touchdowns. Could easily see 12 to 1,400 yards as well, and I think he could be a top 10 guy. And he's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 29. He stats in, gets ranked as my wide receiver 22 right now, and at his ADP, you should be expected to spend just over 5% of your budget on him. That is super cheap for this guy. I'd be willing to spend up to 13% here. Huge value on Pickens. I want to get him on a lot of my rosters as well. Moving into some of the worst values at wide receiver position, I want to talk about Garrett Wilson. And I really do hate to keep bashing on Garrett Wilson. I know he's a guy that I've really just not hyped up at any point over the course of his entire career from a fantasy standpoint. And it's tough because if you watch football, he's clearly an elite player. I love watching him play, and I wish he had the quarterback play and the offense around him to justify and really make the most out of his talents. But he just has yet to turn that into elite fantasy production. And we're once again betting on Aaron Rodgers elevating this entire offense, and we need Garrett Wilson to step up as well. We need him to elevate into that top tier. And I think the issue here with Garrett Wilson is he ends up being a really similar player to a lot of other players in the same tier. You can look at guys like Drake London, guys like Chris Olave, guys like Nico Collins. I think those are guys that are clearly in the same tier, and I'm pretty confident in saying that he's got the worst quarterback of all those. Maybe Aaron Rodgers is better than Derek Carr, but it's just tough to look at that right now because of how many question marks there are around Aaron Rodgers. He wasn't really playing well before last season, and then he tore his Achilles in the first quarter of his first game. Hasn't seemed entirely focused lately either. We don't know how good Aaron Rodgers is going to be, and it just feels like a trap again. There's a lot that can go wrong here in New York. I'm not necessarily excited about it, and it just sort of feels like you're drafting Garrett Wilson to the ceiling. The only way Garrett Wilson really outperforms his ADP is if Aaron Rodgers comes out and plays like an MVP again, which seems like an extremely unlikely outcome. And the issue here is he's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 8. I have him ranked as my wide receiver 14, so it's not like I'm out on Garrett Wilson, but having him outside of the top 12 when he's being drafted as a late first-round pick makes it basically so I never even draft him. And you're currently expected to spend roughly 30% of your auction budget on him. I'd only be willing to spend up to 22%. It doesn't result in me having a lot of him. I don't mind grabbing him if he can get him cheap, but he's not a guy that I'm targeting. There's just too much risk there, and I like the guys around him more, and often he's the most expensive of those guys. So I tend to pass on Wilson, even though I do think he's an elite wide receiver. Next, we've got Brandon Ayuk, who is another guy that I've talked about quite a bit as a guy that I'm not necessarily drafting a lot of, and it's just because I don't really see the world at where he potentially outperforms what he did last season. I do, again, believe that Brandon Ayuk is an elite wide receiver. I don't think there's really any debating that at this point, but the issue is he needed to be the most efficient wide receiver in the NFL last season. Just to finish as the wide receiver 14, he averaged over 18 yards per catch. That is insane. For those of you who don't know or are unfamiliar with that, 15 yards per catch is like a really high-end number. 18 is outlandish. That was tops in the NFL last season among players, I believe, at least 100 targets. And the issue is just he can't possibly recreate a number that high, so you'd need a spike touchdown season for him to match the same performance. And he's currently being drafted as a wide receiver 13, which is ahead of where he finished last season. And the offense now has even more competition for targets. There's been a first-round draft pick on Ricky Pearsall, who I like quite a bit. Makes Brandon Ayuk slot in as my wide receiver 21, so he's not a guy that I necessarily hate, but having to spend an early second-round draft pick, middle of the tier second-round draft pick for the guy, it's just too much for a guy that I can't see even potentially outperforming his ceiling. And then he's also got the built-in downside of a potential trade here. There's a lot of rumors circulating Brandon Ayuk right now. He could easily trade to the Commanders. That would be a huge downgrade going to a rookie quarterback with, again, target competition with Terry McLaurin. Be traded to the Steelers. Again, a quarterback downgrade in all likelihood. Not necessarily getting the high-end performance or high-end targets as well. It's just not great at all. And you're expected to spend roughly 20% of your budget to get this guy on your roster, and I wouldn't be willing to go over 15. And 15 is honestly being like generous because I think he's so talented and he's going to have some spike weeks, and I'm leaving in some room for me to be wrong there. But I just can't justify the ADP right now. I don't see him outperforming it, and I think you're more than likely looking at like a low end wide receiver 2 for you guys this season. Next up for the third wide receiver that I don't find myself drafting and really don't think is a value, and shout out Mark for calling this one. I got Devontae Adams here, and I'm just effectively out on him this season. Last season, he only had 4 weeks where he finished as a top 12 wide receiver, and his fantasy production over the course of the season is just pretty much fluffed up by a couple of massive games, including a 21 target performance in the fantasy championship. Obviously, he won a lot of people's fantasy championships. That sort of, saved people and saved his season, really. But if you remember, just the week before that, he had 1 catch for 4 yards. So you're super lucky if you made it to your championship with him on your roster. And on top of that, there's more target competition on this roster with the addition of Brock Bowers. The offense should be just a lower volume offense in general. They've got Luke Getsy, who is one of the ran one of the slowest paced offenses in the NFL last season, ran one of the run heaviest offenses in the NFL last season. This is going to be an offense that wants to run the ball. They're going to want to play defense. They're going to let the play clock churn down, and there's not going to be nearly enough opportunity here for Davante Adams to put up big numbers. It took him over 170 targets just to be good last season. He wasn't even great, and I think it's more than reasonable to assume he's going to drop off beyond that as well. And he's also right on that age cliff. He's 31 years old. We've seen that be a huge cliff for a lot of wide receivers in the past. Just think back to Julio Jones several years ago. And these are high-end wide receivers. Roddy White, Julio Jones, Jordy Nelson. These high-end wide receivers that just fall off a cliff at this age. And there's just plenty to be scared about here. He's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 11, and he currently slots in as my wide receiver 15. Even as the wide receiver 15 there, I still feel like that's a little bit too high there. I don't find myself pulling the trigger on Adams even if he slips a little bit, and it's just too scary for me there. There's a lot going wrong. The quarterback is not going to be good enough to give him high-end numbers. You're not going to have a lot of high-quality targets. You should have less targets this season as well, and you'd be looking at spending roughly 24% of your budget on Adams. I wouldn't be willing to go over 19%, and even that would make me feel a little bit squeamish. So I'm pretty much out on Adams. I don't see myself drafting him. He could bite me. He could be a really good player again this season, but in general, I like to try and be a year early when I get out on these guys. I'd rather be a year early than a year late. If you draft a guy like this and they end up just completely dudding, which does happen, it really does sink your season if you're spending a high-end second-round pick on a guy that could potentially be worthless. It's going to make it really hard for you guys to be high-end performers this season. So I'd like to avoid him, even if he does have some spike weeks. I think it's going to be a bumpy ride. I don't want anything to do with it. Next up, we've got kind of a surprising one for me, but the more I thought about it, the more I was okay with it. It's going to be Devonta Smith, who's a guy that I just don't see myself drafting a lot of. And like I said, this one does scare me a little bit. Devonta Smith is clearly an extremely talented player. We've got a lot of moving pieces in Philadelphia, so there is room for me to be wrong here, but I just can't get around the ADP right now. He's currently being drafted as a wide receiver 19, stats out and slots in as my wide receiver 26. So I still think he's a high-end wide receiver 3, low-end wide receiver 2, but I'm just worried that the Eagles are going to be a much more run-heavy offense this season with the addition of Saquon Barkley. On top of that, Devonta Smith is probably the third most important weapon in this offense behind A.J. Brown and Saquon Barkley, and that makes it really tough for an offense that's not necessarily going to have a ton of passing yards. I think Jalen Hurts will probably finish with the 35 to 3,700 passing yards this season, probably throw for just over 20 passing touchdowns. That just doesn't leave a lot of room for Devonta Smith to put up monster numbers when we know 1,200 and probably 10 are going to A.J. Brown, and a lot of those are going to get sprinkled into Dallas Goedert. A lot of that's going to go to Saquon Barkley. There's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense, and Devonta Smith just really hasn't shown an ability to be a consistent elite performer when everybody's healthy on this offense. Most of his big games 2 years ago came when Dallas Goedert was out. We saw Devonta Smith finish last season as the wide receiver 19, but if you take out his hot start, just go from weeks 5 on, he was the wide receiver 26, which is exactly where I have him. He's going to have some explosive games because he's a great player. He's going to have some big touchdowns. He's obviously an elite athlete, an elite wide receiver, and if he were the number one in an offense, he could certainly get it done. But you're looking at potentially a low passing volume offense on a team that's got a better wide receiver than him. So it just makes it really tough for me to justify the ADP. You'd be looking at spending roughly 12.5% of your budget on him. I'd be willing to go up to 10. So again, I don't hate him. I'll end up with him a little bit, but it's just not a guy that I want to be targeting. And I think it's going to be a pretty bumpy ride. I'd want him to be my wide receiver 3 or even like a flex. And if you're relying on him as a wide receiver 2, it just gets a little bit scary because I don't think he's going to be a reliable weekly asset for us. And the last receiver that I find is a bad value this season is actually Chris Godwin. And really the issue here with Godwin is he just doesn't fit the mold of a player that I want to target on my roster. He seems to be a declining player on a mediocre offense with a lot of competition for targets, actually. You've got Mike Evans there. You've got Rachaad White, who's going to be a target hog. Jalen McMillan was added to the roster. He's a rookie they like quite a bit. Cade Otton's been getting better and better over the course of the years. And I just don't think Godwin's a guy that's going to command a high enough target share to justify being a really good fantasy asset this season. And he just also effectively has no ceiling here. He had 1 week all of last season where he finished with over 20 points in PPR formats, and that was the year where Baker had a career year. I think it's reasonable to assume that with the Buccaneers losing their elite play caller and Dave Canales, Chris Godwin getting another year older, Baker Mayfield probably regressing a little bit. This is not a guy that has much of a ceiling at all, and it just means he's not a guy that I'm going to be super excited about starting. If you're in a 3 or 4 wide receiver league and you want to play him as your flex, you'll get some points. He's probably going to average just over 10 fantasy points per game. He'll be decent, but There's just no way that you draft Chris Godwin and you end up looking back on the season thinking he's a reason why you won your league. I just don't see that being an outcome here. I don't think he's got the upside to potentially put up a double digit touchdown season. I'd be shocked if he breaks 1,200 yards. Maybe he sees 100 catches if things go really great for him, but even that seems super unlikely as well. And he's just not someone that I'm excited about right now. He ranks out as my wide receiver 48, despite being drafted as the wide receiver 35. So just not excited about him at all. I think he's a low end flex play, a guy that you can play and get some points, but not a guy that's going to win your week. And being drafted in some of the top 36, you're spending like a 5th or 6th round draft pick on this guy. He's just not someone that I think can make a difference for your roster. So I'm avoiding him. At his current ADP, you'd be looking at spending 3.5% of your budget on him. I wouldn't be willing to spend over 2%. I view him as like a bench player, low end flex play, a guy that you can start if you need to, not someone that's going to make a difference for your roster. So I'd avoid him. I don't hate him. It's just he's not a guy that I really want on my roster and just doesn't fit the mold of someone that I think can actually make a difference for us. So that'll do it for the best and worst values at the wide receiver position this season. I'll try and do another video on these like later into August when we get really into the heat of draft season. We'll have a lot more data to go with them just based off of actual platform ADPs, platform auction values as well. We'll make sure that we're highlighting auction values across all the platforms, tell you guys what the best values are on all of those as well. So stay tuned for all that. It's going to be a lot of fun. The next video will be the best and worst values at the tight end position. Might just go rank my top 10 tight ends as well. I'll see how I'm feeling there. But going to be a lot of fun. Just stay tuned for all these videos. We're going to keep putting out 3 to 4 videos a week over the course of the rest of the off season. Do even more of that when we get into the regular season. Thinking about doing some live streams as well. Maybe doing some live underdog drafts on Sundays or something just to sort of sprinkle it in there as well. I know you guys have sort of wanted some live content as well. So stay tuned for that. I'll make some announcements before I do any of that. But it's going to be a lot of fun. It's always going to be free. So if you guys want to keep making sure you get access to that, just make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you can be here all season long to let me help you win your league this season. So it's going to be a lot of fun and appreciate all you guys quite a bit. So if you made it this far, please do give this video a thumbs up. Helps with the algorithm and just helps me know I'm doing a good job and all that. So thanks, guys. You guys mean a lot, and I'll see you next time. Peace. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.